I'm excited to introduce Charlotte. Charlotte got their BS in zoology from the University of Florida in May 2023. After coming to Archbold, before coming to Archbold, most notably, they work for the Florida Ornithological Society's breeding bird atlas as a writer, as a volunteer bander at the Cape Florida Banding Station, and a bird guide and surveyor at the Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge. Charlotte joined the lab in pretty special circumstances after another intern had to leave early in the middle of the breeding season, which was our busiest time. But despite being thrown in at the deep end, they started swimming right away. They found many nests and were so much fun to work with. They also took on extra responsibilities of being the lodge parent when Caitlin left. I've heard that they're a really good cook, although I've never had the privilege of tasting any of their treats. Hint, hint. Charlotte took on a pretty hard project and toiled for many hours beyond the regular toiling we do in the field anyways. Then they went on to spend hours and hours in the lab making many specific measurements that you will see. Their project is a labor of love, or rather highlights a love of labor, which will help them tremendously as a field biologist. Charlotte's project reveals the wonderful biology of scrub jay nest architecture that I invite them to describe without further ado.
Project is based on the observations I had during my time as an Avian ecology intern at this lab. Through our nest monitoring work, I became familiar with the appearance and the structure of Florida scrub jay nests and began to notice subtle and sometimes not so subtle differences between them. For this group, this is the latter. These two nests made by two different breeding pairs, you can see a clear difference in the platform size and the sheer amount of sticks used. Another aspect of variation you can see, once we remove the rest of the nest, is in between the nest cups made by the cups, and we see clear differences in the amount of fibers used, the heights of these cups, as well as their internal diameter. Even nests made by the exact same breeding pair had their small differences. And this variation that I observed inspired my project in order to investigate reasons behind this variation. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit and learn about the study of nests and nest building and where my own research comes into play.
Sorry, you have a mic? Yeah.
Hello, everyone on Zoom. Hopefully my slides are able to convey that part. Moving on. So a little bit about nest background information. So nests play an important role in the life history of many different species, ranging from reptiles to mammals to fish. Though the group you're most likely to expect me to talk about today, based on my title slide, and the one most commonly associated with nest, is birds. So for birds, nests serve as a site of both egg incubation and nestling development, and as such are tied directly to the reproductive fitness of individuals. And because of this, we expect it to be under intense selective pressure to optimize nesting survival. And one of the ways in which species do this is by adapting to environmental conditions. So some studies have documented that species alter their nest morphology for insulation purposes in order to maintain an optimal nest microclimate with seasonal temperature changes. Further studies investigating this variation of nest morphology further have looked into the effect of experience on this, considering the role of factors such as social interactions, previous nest failure/success, and learning. Despite these clear avenues for variation, historically, the literature has focused on the rigid and innate nature of nest building, basically saying there is one way to build a nest and birds just already know how to do it. However, the turn of the 21st century has brought an increase or a revival of the interest in nests and their plasticity. However, these studies have mainly focused on cavity nesting species using nest boxes due to the ease of study, leaving open nesting species to be largely overlooked. And this is where the Florida scrub jay comes into play. So Florida scrub jays, they are open cup nesters, and they construct a nest consisting of a platform mainly made of sticks that surrounds an internal cup mainly composed of palmetto fibers, and is where the eggs actually sit in the nest. In this species, both sexes participate in nest construction, with the male primarily concerned with platform construction and the female spending more time shaping the inner cup. Pairs will often re-nest after failure or abandonment, and they rarely ever reuse their nests. These last two factors in particular make them very useful for nest morphology studies. So for this project, I assessed variation in the nest morphology within a single breeding season in the avian population of Florida scrub jays. I investigated the potential role of climate, success of nest building, learning, and genetics by analyzing nest morphology data in relation to several relevant ecological factors. And these factors are as such. Julian day, which refers to the day since January 1st. This would indicate that the seasonal or that the variation would be due to seasonal changes in insulation requirements. Next factor is nest attempt number, referring to whether it's the first, second, third, etc. time nesting this season. And this could indicate the variation is due to changes in investment. It's important to note that nest number and Julian date are highly correlated, meaning if we see a trend in one with the variation, we'll likely see it in the other. So we have to account for this in the analysis, which I will get into later, to basically see if the trend we observe is based on one factor or the other. Our third factor that we looked at was prior nesting experience, dividing up individuals based on if it's their first time nesting this season or if they had at least one full prior season of nesting experience. This would indicate the role of learning and nest construction. And finally, we looked at the role of genetics, looking within breeding pairs and assessing repeatability of nest morphology. So the questions that my project sought to answer were: one, do nests vary significantly from one pair to the other, looking at inter-pair variation? Do nests significantly vary over the course of the breeding season? Does prior nest building experience affect nest morphology? And are nests made by the same breeding pair repeatable in structure, looking at intra-pair variation? So my predictions. For this study, I predicted that Julian day would affect nest morphology, and that as Julian day increases, meaning as the season goes on, all parameters in nest morphology relating to insulation would decrease, and these include internal cup diameter, cup depth, wall thickness, cup mass, and cup mass. I also predicted that all other aspects not related to insulation would stay the same over the course of the season. My reasoning for this is supported by the insulation hypothesis, which states that as temperatures increase as the season progresses, the insulatory requirements needed to maintain an optimal nest microclimate would decrease, and thus nest morphology would focus. Looking at the experience, I predicted that more experienced individuals will construct larger and denser nests than inexperienced individuals. And this would manifest in that all aspects of nest morphology would be greater for experienced birds. And the reasoning behind this is the breeder experience hypothesis, stating that inexperienced birds will make simpler nests than ones with prior experience, both in size and as well as density. And finally, looking at intra-pair repeatability, I predicted that nests made by the same pair will have significant, moderate repeatability for all parameters of nest morphology. My reasoning behind this is because more variation and thus low repeatability is typically seen for species in which a single nest is involved with nest construction. And because Florida scrub jays have both sexes participating in this construction, I expected relatively lower variation because of this. However, based on my previous predictions suggesting the role of environment and learning, this moderate prediction for repeatability would focus on the interplay between genetic and non-genetic factors. So for this study, I included nests of color-banded jays at the Archbold Biological Station with known life histories. Only unfledged nests were used in the study due to the effect of large nestlings on nest morphology, and nests were measured only when they were no longer in use. Don't worry, no scrub jays were harmed in the making of this project. And that was either after failure or abandonment. In total, 98 nests from 51 breeding pairs were utilized for the sake of my study. So getting into my methods and all that I suffered throughout this project, my data collection consisted of two separate parts, starting with the collection of nest morphology data while the nest is still attached to its original nesting substrate like a tree. So the dimension or the nest morphological data that I collected, the dimensions included the internal cup diameter, which was the minimum and maximum distances within the fibrous cup, the external diameter, which was the average of the minimum and maximum distances between the topmost edges of the platform, cup depth, which was the distance between the bottom of the cup where the eggs actually sit to the rim, and nest height for my study refers to the vertical distance between the base of the nest and the top of it. And finally, wall thickness, which was the average of 8 equal measurements taken along the circumference of the internal cup and averaged. The second part of my data collection included removing these nests from their original nesting substrate, placing them into separate labeled paper bags, allowing them to dry for at least 72 hours. After the 72-hour drying period, they were deconstructed, and each part of the nest was weighed separately. And from this, we got the masses that included the mass of the cup fibers, mass of the platform sticks, mass of non-fiber cup materials. Now, this refers to anything woven into the cup that was not a palmetto fiber, and finally, the total nest mass. And this is what it looks like after I finished, the night I finished actually collecting all the nests, with 98 nests in the lab all at once drying at the same time. Don't worry about me, I'm fine. I was fine. No interns were harmed in the making of this. So to kind of summarize my results, for Julian day and nest number, the only ones that showed any significant seasonal change were that of wall thickness and cup mass. All other aspects of nest morphology did not significantly change over the course of the season. In terms of nesting experience, only one parameter showed significant change, and that was internal diameter. Now we're going to look into how they actually changed with my graphs. So for average cup wall thickness, we see a seasonal decline in this with increasing Julian day, and this this is shown for both Julian day and for nesting attempt number. As I previously stated, these two factors are highly correlated. So basically, to understand which one of these factors themselves caused this decline, we accounted for that by comparing it only for first nest. So this graph shows average wall thickness over the course of the season for only first nest for Julian day, basically negating the effect that nest number would have on this decline. And we see while it does show a negative relationship, it is no longer significant, pointing more towards the nest number, accounting for this seasonal change. Similarly, for nest mass, we see the seasonal decrease again with both nesting attempt and Julian day. However, again, when we use it for first nest only, again, we see the decrease still is no longer significant. Looking at average internal diameter in terms of female nesting experience, we found that females with prior experience constructed greater nests than those with no prior experience, meaning the average internal diameter was greater. And this relationship was found to be significant. Looking at intrapair nest morphology, something I found very interesting, all aspects of nest morphology, except for non-fiber cup material mass, had low repeatability and were non-significant. However, non-fiber cup material mass had moderate repeatability. However, again, this is not significant. Basically summarize what I just said. Wall thickness and cup mass decreased with Julian day and nest number. However, both did not significantly decrease when using only first nest. We also found that internal diameter was greater for experienced females when compared to inexperienced females, and that non-fiber cup material mass had moderate repeatability but was non-significant, while all other aspects had low and non-significant repeatability. So let's review our predictions that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. So I originally predicted that nest morphology would change in relation to Julian day, with all aspects of nest morphology relating to insulation decreasing with increasing Julian day. Now, this was not the case for internal cup diameter nor cup depth. However, we did see it for wall thickness and cup mass. We also saw that all other aspects remained the same over the course of the season. However, our reasoning behind this doesn't hold up anymore, because we did find that using only first nest for Julian day, that relationship was no longer significant, pointing more towards the role of the nest number in causing this seasonal decline. Now, for prior nest experience, I originally predicted that more experienced individuals will construct larger and denser nests than experienced individuals, with all parameters of nest morphology being greater. So we did not see that all parameters of nest morphology were greater, but we did see it for internal cup diameter. And the trend that we did see did agree with our original hypothesis, with the breeder experience hypothesis, in that inexperienced birds make simpler, i.e. smaller, and less dense nests than those with prior experience. Looking at genetics, particularly for the intrapair repeatability prediction, I originally predicted that nests made by the same pair will have significant moderate repeatability for all aspects of nest morphology. As we know, yes, one of them had moderate repeatability, and that was the non-fiber cup material mass. However, for the rest of them, they all showed low and non-significant repeatability. It's also important to note that the moderate repeatability that we did see was not significant. There we are. So getting into my discussion. So looking further into results, we found that nests of florist scrubges largely do not significantly change over the course of the breeding season. And while we do see a seasonal decrease for wall thickness and cup mass, it is not significant for Julian day when only considering first nest, suggesting that the variation is not related to insolation or seasonal temperature changes. And this is likely due to the subtropical climate of the region, meaning there's less extreme changes in temperature and thus less of a pressure to alter nest insulation because of this. We did find, however, that our results suggest that renesting attempt number, however, we did see the results that we did find did suggest that the successive nesting attempt number is what leads to this trend. Basically, something occurs between attempts that causes a decrease in investment for females in particular, as we do not see any of the male nesting characteristics changing over the course of the season. So potential explanations behind this could relate to the additional energy expenditure of females related to reproduction as well as incubation, coupled with prior nest construction energy expenditure. Was also time constraints could play a role in this. Oh, in addition, for further research on this, you could look at the breeding or the condition of females over the course of the season, how that changes with time. Another factor that could potentially account for this refers to time constraints. Later in the season, there is an increase in snake predation pressure. Therefore, it might just be a mad dash for these birds to try to get in the nest before they eventually hit that wall. But why they make cuts with the cup and rather than the platform is something that needs to be looked into further. For example, you could look at how long it takes to actually construct the nest compared to the platform. Perhaps it takes more time weaving than it does just like stacking the nesting materials. But again, further research is needed for that. Another factor that can come into play is resource availability, meaning just as a referring to the palmetto cup virus in particular, and we can look into this by looking at the burned areas and the territory quality that the breeding pairs have to deal with essentially over the course of the season. I was just so excited for you guys to see the slide. If you really want some time to absorb it. Thank you. Goodness. So for the role of experience in nest building, we see that first-time nesting females constructed smaller nest cups when compared to more experienced females. And this is in line with the previous literature on the builder's experience hypothesis in that they build less complex nests than experienced females. However, why this supposed learning is only seen for females, again, remains to be investigated. You could perhaps, for further research aims, you could look at the complexities of weaving compared to platform construction and how that relates to how these are learned by the individuals. And looking at the role of genetics, we found that females were moderately repeatable in the non-fiber materials aspect of nest composition. However, it was non-significant, so we can't completely rule out the rule of random chance in this variation. This could be investigated further by looking at the heritability of this trait, as Archibald does track the lineages, and we could track this along, basically, as the female lineages go down. We could also look at the role of this aspect of nest morphology, particularly the non-fiber materials, in nestling survival. Perhaps if it is more closely related to nestling survival, it is under more intense selective pressure, and that's the reason why it has some genetic component. But again, further study is needed to determine the effect. So I'd like to thank all my lab mates, all the fellow interns at the Lodge, as well as in my lab for their constant guidance and support. I'd also like to acknowledge that Archibald Biological Station's properties are located within the traditional lands and waters unconquered Seminole and Miccosukee tribes, and we honor these tribes and all their indigenous ancestors of the region.